Hello, thanks for tuning in. I'm Jim Roger.
And I'm Peggy Kane.
And you're watching The Cutting Edge, Revealing the Truth. Well, you know, Peggy, our show tonight brings us back into the 1940s to a man who was formerly called Ed Cameron, who is now better known as Al Bielek. And tonight's show will be dealing with the people and the events surrounding the famous Philadelphia experiment. Al's story begins in the 1940s as he reflects upon his past life as a PhD scientist, along with his brother Duncan, who also was a scientist as well. Both Ed and his brother Duncan joined the Navy in 1940 and were using their expertise on a secret scientific project called Project Rainbow at the time. And this would ultimately lead them, that is, Project Rainbow would ultimately lead them into the Philadelphia experiment. And during the war years, there was a need to develop a technology that would make vessels at sea invisible, or invisible to the enemy, either visually or optically, or at least with radar. Because the German wolf packs were actually sinking 50% of all of the shipping going in and out of England. So something had to be done. And so anyway, some of the things in the interview that we have here with Al Bielek tonight, just 20 years ago, may have seemed like magic. Mm-hmm. But there have been some technologies in the 90s that have came over the horizon that apply very much to what Al was talking about. That gives his story viability and strength. So that's another good reason to do another 101 class, so to speak, on the Philadelphia experiment, as well as to mention some of this new technology that hasn't been mentioned before, I don't think, on other shows about the Philadelphia experiment.
Well, you know, when I first heard Al, the story was fascinating, but it seemed so outrageous. It just seemed so bizarre. But you know, he was really so clear in his facts, and it was like, boy, if somebody has made this up, they've done a lot. He's done a lot of research into this.
I know. I agree. The first time I heard it myself, I think he was on Coast to Coast radio, and I said, boy, this sounds pretty outrageous, but with an open mind, and keeping it that way, and hopefully being able to connect some of the dots in the future. Mm-hmm. At some other time. It was the attitude that I had at the time. But you remember the old saying that the adage that when an advanced technology, an advanced civilization with their advanced technology to a lesser advanced technology, it might actually look like magic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, some of the things, some of the Tesla technology that was going on during the Philadelphia experiment borders on this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it certainly does.
Yeah. Actually, the whole idea of Project Rainbow was conceived by Nikola Tesla back in 1932. And it wasn't until the early 40s that this stuff came to fruition. And we'll talk more about that later on as we go. But without any further delay, let's meet Al Bielek in our first clip. And here in the first clip, Al will mention Project Rainbow.
My name is Al Bielek. I am Al Bielek. Perhaps the last living survivor of the infamous Philadelphia experiment, as it was sometimes called. And Al Bielek, might add, is my legal name. It is not my original name. Edward A. Cameron was my original family name. And that is a long story how Ed Cameron became Al Bielek, but today the only records extant are of Al Bielek, complete with a birth certificate and all of the usual documentation. All of it is there. But to attempt to prove that I was once Ed Cameron is extremely difficult at this time. It requires access to classified documents and listings, which both the Navy and the Air Force have. And I might add, if you want to do any investigating yourself on this, go ahead, be my guest. But to go back to the basic story here of the Philadelphia experiment, it was started really in the beginning, 1932, by Nikola Tesla. It was an idea he had. One of the many things he investigated. How do you make something invisible? It was a nice idea, a laboratory idea, if you will, because there were already laboratory precedents for this in the sense that you can put a glass rod in a particular type of chemical solution, I've forgotten the name, and the glass rod becomes invisible because the index of refraction of both the rod and the fluid are the same. Therefore, it becomes invisible in that fluid and to anyone outside of that container or beaker of the fluid. So that started it off in a way, and as a laboratory idea, a toy, if you will. How can you make something invisible? Well, Tesla got in on it. He had his own ideas. About 2 years of theoretical experimentation. He was not in the New York area all the time. He was up at the University of Chicago for some 2 years. He had people up there he was working with. Then, of course, in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the 32nd President of the United States. And he knew Tesla from World War I, 1917-18 period, when Roosevelt was Under Secretary of the Navy. And he knew Tesla because Tesla did a lot of work for the government, actually at Roosevelt's invite, including, most people may not believe this, but it's documented if you know where to look, a complete voice-sound communication system, voice communication to Europe from Long Island, static-free. It was Tesla's system, and it can be proven today that it did exist. It was classified for many years. But he developed that, and nobody could believe it at that time because there was no such thing as static-free voice communication over the oceans then. No problem today, but science has advanced. But he had this idea about invisibility. Roosevelt was elected, and Roosevelt invited him down to Washington. My old friend Tesla, what are you up to these days? Well, Roosevelt already knew pretty well what he was doing. He says, I like your idea. I would like to see you pursue this. I will see that the Navy, because he had been Under Secretary of the Navy and had a lot of connections with the Navy. I'll see if the Navy gives you some money for research and so forth, but move this project back around New York. He was working then, he had a lab in New Jersey as well as in New York, and it eventually devolved down to Princeton University and the Institute of Advanced Studies, and most of the work was done there. 32, 36, they had a first experimental test that failed. 1940, they had the first experimental test that did not fail, but actually worked, involving a small Navy ship at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And as soon as it did, Tesla proved that it could work, that there was a basis for it. The Navy classified it and called it Project Rainbow. And it went on from there. The object of the game was, because of the fact that during that period, during the period prior to World War II and when we became involved in it, the German Wolfpack fleets of submarines were very successful, going all over the Atlantic and sinking any kind of shipping going to England at that time. And then, of course, after we were involved in the war, they were sinking our ships. The Wolfpack fleets sank roughly 50% of the shipping going across the Atlantic.
Well, there you have it. The last survivor that we know of, maybe there are others around, but he did survive the Philadelphia experiment.
Yes, and, sort of in a strange way, in a new guise, as a new person, practically.
Exactly. You know, we have a photo. While we're talking, if it's possible to bring, there it is. Boy, that's Jessie. She's just amazing.
She is amazing.
That is Ed Cameron. That photo is from the 1939 yearbook from Princeton University, and Ed Cameron being Al Bielek. Now, to me, that does look like Al Bielek as a younger man.
It does.
The same forehead, eye, bone structure. Mm-hmm. So that's it from the Princeton University yearbook of 1939.
Not only that, but when Al speaks and he gives all these facts, they don't really vary. I mean,
they're consistent.
He's consistent with his story.
If you're lying and you tell a story for a long, long time, sooner or later you're going to slip up on a few inconsistencies. And to my knowledge, he hasn't done that at all.
No. No one can find holes in his story. They may not believe him, but they can't really find holes in the story.
Yeah. You know, and there was a strong need in those days to develop that technology. The Germans were sinking everything they could that was supplying England, you know, coming in and out of England. So they had a strong will to develop that technology. And originally, the technology was designed to make ships invisible, optically invisible. And as we go on, we'll see that they backed off on that requirement to the point where they would be happy if they could just make them invisible to radar. Because they realized, well, if the ships were traveling in the ocean at night and they were invisible, they'd be bumping into each other.
That could be a problem, although it's a pretty big ocean.
Yeah. Well, when you get close to these ports, it's,
oh, yeah.
you know, it gets dangerous.
That's true.
You know, Al did mention static-free voice communication from Nikola Tesla. And, you know, everybody has always said, well, Marconi was the father excuse me, not the father, but the first one to have modulated voice transmission back and forth across the Atlantic. Not so. Tesla did it just incidentally to some other work he was doing. Never really thought too much about it. And about, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, I as a former member of the old Tesla Society, know that they held a court case on that, and they proved it, and that honor, even though they've both been dead for ages now, that honor goes to Nikola Tesla, legally.
Nikola Tesla was a genius,
Absolutely.
a true genius. I think people are now, you know, becoming more familiar with some of his extraordinary experiments and things, but he was just sort of like forgotten for a while there.
He was way ahead of his time.
Oh, yes.
You know, the day that he died, I think he lived correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure. I think he lived to be about 92 years old. And the day he died, the authorities, I think, rushed into his apartment where he was living in, I think it was New York, and took every scrap of paper that they could find because of his technology, his ideas, his inventions. In the 1930s, he was drawing ideas on particle beam tools that could be used as weapons. You know, that everything usually turns into a weapon sooner or later. Yeah. And so they were hot on his trail, and they wanted this information. And the very day that he died, within 2 hours of his death, his apartment was just ransacked, and everything that he had, every paper that he had writing on was just taken. Yeah. So anyways, that's a little side note about the first voice communication across the Atlantic Ocean. That was Nikola Tesla, folks, and it was proven in court. Okay, in our next clip, we'll learn a little bit, we'll get a little bit more technical here, and we'll learn a little bit more about the electronics involved, and something that didn't go as planned, folks.
But the implementation of the electronics to make a ship, any single ship, as much less a fleet, invisible, became very difficult. Tesla had his first successful test, and they gave him a battleship. Roosevelt says, okay, you're successful, I think you can make anything invisible, put a battleship in there in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and you can work on that. Well, he started to produce the equipment for it, but he knew that the amount of power required to make a ship of that size invisible with the techniques and system he was then using, which was successful on a small ship, a 350-ton cutter or something like that, that it would take enormous amounts of power, and he was concerned that the power requirement is such that it would affect mentally or possibly kill the sailors. So in March 42, Tesla bowed out. He literally walked out on the project. He says, I will not be responsible for the deaths of sailors. He was an extremely ethical man. So Dr. John von Neumann was invited to take over, and he did. Dr. John von Neumann was at the Institute of Advanced Study. I knew him quite well. And he took over the project. He made some changes, increased the power, and changed it from a constant field, an analog type system with multiple frequencies, and very briefly, whether it was analog or whether it was a pulse system a la John von Neumann, they had to interact with several areas. Now, some people may still not believe this, but there is a gravity field, there is a time field, and of course everyone knows about electromagnetics. They don't know everything about it, but nevertheless they know there's electric fields and magnetic fields, and they had to interact with all of these to produce a local phenomena of invisibility. We were producing, you might say, a shell-type field around the vehicle, whether it was later on an aircraft or a Navy ship or a merchant ship. It warped the time field, it warped the light field, the electromagnetic field, so that literally light, instead of going up to that object and reflecting off of it, which gives you your image, if it was bent around the object, the ship, all you would see was in the back of the ship. You wouldn't see the ship. It would become invisible to you for the simple reason that it was shielded by the warping of light energy and warping of electromagnetic energy. And that was the basis for the whole experiment. And in the lab it worked, and in a small ship it worked, but when it came to the follow-on test with John von Neumann in charge, he says, no, we don't need to take a battleship. We can do it, improve it first with a smaller ship, a destroyer. The first really successful test took place in June of 1943. And it was not in the Navy Yard. It was taking place down about 6 miles south off a small island in the Delaware River. I think it was the Delaware River. About 6 miles south of the Navy Yard. And the first test on that date was very successful. Then they ordered some changes. The Navy finally decided, well, in view of all of the circumstances, we don't really want full invisibility. All we want is radar invisibility. If we're on a convoy at night and we can't see other ships, we may literally collide with each other. So we got to be able to physically see the ships, but we don't want the radar to be able to pick up the image of the ship. So the compromise was radar invisibility only. The final test for that, for the newly revamped and done experiments, was 12 August 1943. And they had those tests on 12 August 43. And for 3 days in advance, myself, my brother Duncan, and everybody else connected with it, and the crew, and I might add that Duncan and I were selected because to really be in charge of the operations on board the ship and the special equipment involved, because of the fact we both had PhDs in physics. We both understood thoroughly the physics and the technology involved. And as they told us, they said, if something goes wrong during the test, you're on your own, and it has to be up to you to know what to do, to figure out what to do in case something goes wrong. Well, of course it did on the second test on 12 August 43. It went drastically wrong. And we didn't know how wrong until after we were in the middle of it. The first test went very smoothly. They got a full invisibility from an adjacent ship, and all of that was well documented. Von Neumann was there and other scientists, as well as the man who was in charge of the whole thing for the Navy. And the second test, they turned the equipment on. We had to turn the equipment on radio link control. They told us, okay, go ahead, turn everything on. We did. Everything apparently worked formally and in a completely normal manner for about 30 to 60 seconds, and then things started to go haywire.
Mm-hmm.
You could hear the birds in the background there.
Yeah.
Actually, that was just before a rainstorm, and if you can believe it, a bedarkened sky over Tucson.
Well, so that's a rare thing.
Yeah, we didn't have a lot of natural sunlight on that interview, but nevertheless, I thought it was a great interview. But the technology involved in what they were trying to do involved setting up a field around the ship that would actually take the light from behind the ship, bend it and fold it around and bring it back together again seamlessly. So if you were looking there, you'd just look and all you would see would be the horizon.
Yeah.
And
so actually what you're seeing is, you're not actually seeing the object, you're seeing light reflecting
right
off an object.
Now, that's not too far-fetched, folks, because the Japanese have a type of clothing, and the U.S. military does too, because I've seen on TV, that does the same thing. Optically, it takes light from behind a soldier, and it brings the images, the trees or the vegetation, whatever's behind them, and it puts it in front of them.
Wow,
and
that's
Jaime
interesting.
Maussan, up at the International UFO Congress, showed a videotape demonstrating Japan's version of this technology. So the idea of folding light around things, it's really modern day, state-of-the-art technology is just not out for the public right now.
Sure.
Could you imagine a bank robber? By the way, there's a picture of Nikola Tesla on the screen, everybody. But there's a man that had a conscience, and we'll find out why a little further into this show.
Yeah.
But could you imagine a bank robber?
You can imagine all kinds of things with invisibility. I'm telling you, that could boggle the imagination.
Yeah. So anyways, success had already been achieved, excuse me, earlier with this technology. And now for the first time, they're going to go out and they're going to try it on something really big. This would require a lot more power, a lot more energy, and quite a bit more technology too.
You know, before we get into the serious heavy thing, it just reminded me of that last Harry Potter movie where they have this cloak that they keep putting around themselves and suddenly they become invisible.
Sort of like Lord of the Rings too. And
Yeah.
You put the ring on. Yeah,
Yeah, it's sort of interesting.
Well, you know, excuse me, apparently in 1942, at that point in time, Nikola Tesla was the chief scientist on this project. And when Tesla realized that I think the Department of the Navy wanted to have live human beings subjected on board the ship and being subjected to those high levels of radio frequency radiation, he refused. He said, no, we can't do that. They said, yes, we're going to do it. So Tesla said, well, that's it. I'm done with the project. So the man had a conscience.
Yes, he did.
And so he backed out. He backed out of the project completely. And
Well, you think that they would have experimented as far as, you know, with using the human beings on the ship. They would have done some further experiments with maybe organic individuals, whether it be animals, not to say that I go with that, but, you know, rather than just jumping right into having this full invisibility project with these sailors on board, not knowing how it was going to turn out.
Well, anyways, you're right, Peggy. Dr. John von Neumann, N-E-U-M-A-N-N, a German fellow, stepped into Tesla's position and took over the project. And according to Al, doing this with a large destroyer, a bigger type of experiment, in other words, involved a whole new set of dynamics. This involved warping or altering the electromagnetic field. You know, radio frequency has an electric field and a magnetic field. And this would actually alter time, because time is involved with these fields, according to Al Bielek. So there was quite a bit more to this. And realizing the complexities involved, they decided to compromise and go for a lesser level of technology. Instead of making the ships completely invisible, they decided to just, if we could cloak them so radar couldn't see them, that they would be satisfied. So they decided to do that. But on August 12th of 1943, Ed Cameron, at the time, Al Bielek as we know him now, and his brother Duncan were stationed on board that ship for the experiment.
Yes.
Excuse me. And they were in charge, from what I understand, of actually operating the controls on board the stuff on board the ship. So they began the experiment, and that's a picture of the USS Eldridge there. They began the experiment, and everything started out fine for the first 30 to 60 seconds until something went wrong. Something started to go wrong, and things actually started going out of control. And by the time they realized it, folks, it was too late. And so in our next video clip, we'll find out exactly what went wrong and how a leap of faith turned out really to be a leap into hyperspace.
Inside the control room where we were, with a closed lock bulkhead door and no glass windows, I might add, and we had a view of the equipment down in the hold, but we started to get strange problems. First, we were using huge banks of electron tubes, 6L6 type. Some of your listeners may understand and know what a 6L6 is. It's an ancient vacuum tube, but a very good one. That's 3,000 of those things in various banks, driving the field coils of the generators. And, of course, other equipment tied in with those banks of electron tubes, they started, because they were glass, you could see the glowing filaments. They started to change the color and the lighting level of the filaments. Like they get brighter and they get dimmer. That was totally irregular. We knew something was wrong. We didn't know what was wrong, but something was wrong, and we see the meters not acting right. Something's wrong here. We tried to get a radio link out. We couldn't get anything but static. And at that point, we said, something is very wrong. We don't know what it is, but let's shut the equipment down. Well, we went to turn everything off, yank on the control handles and all the knobs. Nothing would move. Everything was frozen. At that point, we knew something was very wrong. Couldn't see or hear anything wrong with the generators. They're all humming like normally, and everything, the meter readings seemed to be normal. At that point, we said, well, there's nothing we can do here. Let's get out of here. So we open the bulkhead door, go out on deck, and we see sailors milling around in a very strange pattern. We both get the idea simultaneously. Well, we can swim quite well. Let's jump overboard and swim to shore. It's not that far. The water's not that deep here. It's only a half mile to shore. You could see it at the point where we first arrived. But at that point in time, we couldn't see anything beyond 6 feet of the railing. It was a heavy fog from what we could see. And it was a heavy fog or mist also to those on the observer ship, so we didn't know that then at that point. So we jump overboard. We never hit the water. There was no water to hit. As we found out much later, the ship was trapped in hyperspace. Now, physicists know what the term hyperspace means. Most civilian engineers and such will only have a passing idea of what it was. And we were there on board the ship, and it was hyperspace. We jumped overboard. We didn't know the ship was already left the harbor, left the water, and was in hyperspace, trapped there. So we jumped overboard. And we started falling. We didn't know what was going on. We felt like we were in sight of each other. We fell through whatever it was. It was like going down an elevator shaft that had no bottom. So we go on down and down and down, and finally we land on dry land at night behind a chain link fence. We recognized the chain link fence as a military fence because there was some lighting there dimly. And we're there a minute or two, and suddenly we're blinding searchlights beaming down on us from some kind of aircraft. We didn't know what it was. It was helicopters, but in 1943 helicopters were experimental, and as we found out, we were no longer in the same time frame. These MPs come out of someplace, grab us, take us to a building on this base. There's a military base. We go in the doors. We're sort of pushed in over to an elevator. Get on the elevator, and we're accompanied down several levels. How far, I didn't really know at that point. And the elevator doors open when we see military and civilian personnel running around, and an elderly gentleman in a gray business suit with only a little bit of gray hair left, walking towards us. And he says, "Gentlemen, I have been expecting you. I'm Dr. John Von Neumann." We looked at him. "You're who?" "Dr. John Von Neumann." "You couldn't be. We left him an hour or so ago. He's a much younger man." He says, "Gentlemen, you are no longer in 1943. This is 1983. You're at Montauk, Long Island." I'm talking about 1983, which IBM computers, as we knew them, the models were variously available, and some Cray Model 1s were around. We didn't see those. But the IBM 360s, 370s were there, and everything related to them, the tape drives as they were in 83, and a lot of other strange electronics that we didn't recognize. He says, "Gentlemen, I got some business to attend to in the office." He says, "Here, I'll take you out to the lounge, sit down and watch TV for a while, and I'll come get you." So they sat us down in the lounge. We start watching TV. Big screen, color TV. Now here we were from 1943, where the largest TV set was a 10-inch CRT, typically the 630 TS RCA chassis, which they froze the production on. And there was a small screen. You can see the image, black and white. They were looking at a great big screen, color TV. A projection, if I remember correctly, but I'm not sure at this point now. But it might have been a direct view screen, because in '83 we did have some big screen, not as big as now, but some big screen color TV. So here we're watching things. We're watching it in freeways, traffic jams, discussions of man on the moon, discussions of the Cold War, the freeway shots of around New York and elsewhere. What is this? In 1943, there was only one freeway in the United States, and that was the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And it was sort of a miracle at the time. The cars could go on unlimited speed if they wanted to, but of course they were driving in 83 a lot faster than they could do in 43. So we're looking at this and saying, maybe the old man's right. I mean, nothing here correlates to what we know. Maybe we are in 1983.
Wow. That would be a shock. Talk about time travel. I mean, can you imagine? But it was very fortuitous that they decided to jump off of that boat, because the sailors who were left behind, their fate was pretty horrible. And I thought I would just mention this right now. While I spent some time with Al, and back on our way to Laughlin, and he was telling me his story.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a little recording of him talking about that event where he actually jumps off of the ship with his brother and other things.
Yes.
And I did some reverse speech on him because I wanted to know it was really
she gets
true.
The real scoop.
It was. You know, he said yes. He said everything was very congruent. So as far as I'm concerned, that really happened. That was my final piece of proof for me. But it was quite an experience for him.
Fascinating. You know, could you imagine when things started to go wrong on board the ship? It's, oh my God, shut it off, and it won't shut off. It's like coming to the toll booth at 75 miles an hour. And you go to put your foot on the brake,
and you've got no
there's
brake.
Nothing there. Here we go.
Oh,
it's like
boy.
the Blues Brothers.
Yeah, really.
Oh, what a deal, you know.
Yeah.
So things really, well, first they lost the radio communication, control of the equipment. The sailors,
Wandering around.
addlepated, wandering around out on the deck aimlessly, not knowing where or what's going on. But it was must have been quite an experience.
You know, I want to add one more thing, because while I do a lot of reverse speech, I also have been involved with electronic voice phenomena, or capturing of spirit voices. And while Al was telling his story to me, because we were in close proximity, we were driving in the car together, there was another spirit person speaking along with Al in the little sections where there was no speech, and yet there was enough noise. And I believe it was either his brother or one of the sailors, because the person said he was not very happy, and he said we were used. He said they just thought of us as mules. And I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. You know, we have a mutual friend that lives in this area, and without speaking to her first, I wouldn't mention her name without permission, but I will say that this lady's from Germany, came over here as a child. Her father was allegedly a German scientist at Montauk, and Al Balick knows him, or knew him.
Yeah.
And her father was, according to Al, was in charge of the operation of the high-tech equipment at Montauk. So, and we're going to get into more of this later on in another whole show, information from Al Balick and wormhole traveling. And so this show really is part one of a second show of this series here, which will be very interesting.
Yes, the Montauk Project is a whole another thing in itself.
We're just beginning to only touch upon that on this show.
Yes, this is just the beginning.
Yeah. You know, I've got to ask you a question, Peggy. When something becomes invisible, where does it go?
Do I know? No, not really.
Good question, huh?
I just wonder, does it stay there, but you just don't perceive it?
You know, Dr. Claude Swanson was talking about the Chinese doing teleportation experiments with objects. And that would be, I bet he could answer that question.
He probably could. But there's a difference between invisibility and teleportation, because teleportation
Well, no, there's a time when it's not at either location.
Oh.
Until it comes out at the other end. Yeah.
Whew.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that little tidbit. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Anyways, Al and was escorted into a waiting room. He waited there for a while on Montauk, and then as the story goes, Dr. John Van Neumann comes up to him, introduces himself, and, well, that's impossible. I just saw you an hour ago. You were, you couldn't be the same person.
A lot younger, really.
And it was watching, imagine traveling in the future, especially accidentally traveling into the future.
Yeah.
And you come from 1943 where television was about this big, and you're looking at a huge big screen TV with freeways, traffic jams, news people talking about men that were walking on the moon. You know, from 1943, what a shock.
That would be a shock, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So anyways, in the next clip, we'll learn more about a conversation that Al Bielek had with Dr. John Van Neumann.
Wandering on our own, we found him in his office. He says to us, "Gentlemen, we've got a problem." I says, "Oh?" "Yes." He says, "You were aboard the Eldridge. You jumped overboard. The Eldridge is trapped in hyperspace. We have to shut it down." He says, "We can cut our equipment down here," but he says, "What happened was that the work we're doing here at Montauk in '83 is producing fields very similar to what you were producing on the Eldridge, and the two locked together and yanked the Eldridge out of the water and into hyperspace." And he says, "We can't do anything about it from here. You gotta go back to the Eldridge and shut the equipment down and wreck it. What do you have to do? Just shut the equipment off." And he said, "The ship will return to 43. We look at him and says, "We don't know how we got here, and you're telling us we have to go back to the Eldridge, and how are we supposed to get there?" "No problem, gentlemen. Here at Montauk, we have complete control over space and time. We can send you any place we want at any time we want," which we learned later on, quite a bit later. I was involved, as well as Duncan, with the Montauk project, but that's a total other story. But they were talking about Montauk in '83, which was fully operational. It could control space and time. It could send you through time, to send you through a wormhole in space to anywhere as they wanted, which is what they were talking about. So with that equipment, now they alluded to this, but in a somewhat skewed sense in the movie, The Philadelphia Experiment. The guys that produced the movie had some good information, but they didn't have all of it, and they didn't have it all correct. But in any case, they said, "We'll send you back to the decks of the Eldridge. We'll put some radiation suits on you, because you we understand we're already damaged with some radiation. But we'll send you back there, find access, do whatever you have to do. Smash the equipment until it turns down, shuts down. Certain items you don't destroy." They told us what it was. There's some small boxes of very special control equipment. So they says, "You leave that intact, destroy the drives to the generators. When the fields from the generators go down, the ship will automatically return to where it started from in '43. So we did as instructed, and we smashed the banks of vacuum tubes, and we heard the generators winding down. I says, "Okay, I guess it's pretty much over. Let's go out on deck." And that's when we saw sailors milling around badly, out of control. I mean, they were mentally fogged, they were ill, they were running around crazily, they were fading in and out of visibility to our eyes. The ship was starting to come back, and on board the ship we didn't see anything wrong, but you couldn't see anything overboard. There was a heavy fog, but the fog started to lift, and we could see we were back in the same surroundings. But some of these sailors were quite literally becoming invisible and becoming revisible, if you will. And we didn't know what was going on, but we knew something was drastically wrong, and they were acting like they were insane. They were babbling. I was hearing comments like, "Who are those crazy guys who were running around on their ship?" And one of them made reference to ETs. They looked like aliens. Didn't know what they were or who they were. And later on in the Naval Board of Inquiries, when Duncan went ahead and jumped overboard again, because when he saw all these guys buried in the steel deck, two buried in the steel deck, two buried in a bulkhead. One of them is our brother Jim. And I went up to Jim, who was half out of the steel and crying and in pain, obviously. I tried to comfort him. He died that way. But Duncan took one look at all of this and says, he jumped over the rail. He looked at me like, "Aren't I coming along?" No, I didn't. I stayed behind. He disappeared. He wound up back at Montauk in '83. It's somewhere around 82, 83. The exact date, it was in the records, we found it later. But I stayed. Jim died. The other guys died. They didn't know what to do about him. I was on the burial detail later where they just literally cut the steel deck plates and took plates and all on the bodies with them. One guy, the fifth guy, survived. He only had his hand up through the wrist buried in the steel. And the Board of Inquiries of the Navy, which they held for 4 days, didn't believe my testimony. They didn't know what to believe. They only knew that something went drastically wrong. And they had a big problem with these guys in and out of visibility. That problem was solved later. It took a number of people, including Dr. Royal Rife, who was in New Jersey at that time, to help solve the problem. They eventually built some special equipment to make these guys stay in our reality. That's another story, but there are parallel realities, and they were shifting in and out.
Apparently, the way they set this experiment up, the way I understand, Al, was they had the ship and they had a toroidal field. A toroidal field is shaped just like a donut with a hole in the middle of it. So everything in the center of it is influenced, meaning the ship. But there's a hole, from up above, so it's not an all-inclusive field. So when Tesla was in charge of the project, he had designed, the way I understand it, an egg-shaped field that totally encompassed everything. And when they went to a slightly different technology, this is where they ran into problems. Earlier, with Tesla's technology in '43, they were successful. But they changed, they went to instead of the egg-shaped field, which would encompass the entire ship, they went to the toroidal field, and this is where things were probably squeezed out in time or something.
Oh, man.
If you can imagine an invisible donut or a toroidal field, in other words. And there's a picture of Dr. John von Neumann, by the way. And so the problems were serious. It's like if you're talking the problems between the Eldridge and Montauk, linking together this way, I guess it's like if you're talking on a two-way radio and you hold the mic button down, no one near you can use that frequency because that energy is out there, and it just nothing can override it, anything that's near you. And so evidently the field energy from the Eldridge was evidently overlapping with Montauk's energy.
Right, yeah, that's so interesting.
Does it make sense that way?
Yes, it does. And I'm just thinking now his brother, Cameron, jumped overboard, so he stayed in 1983.
Went back to 83.
Well, he went forward into 83.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Let's get this straight. But Al stayed on the ship
to
finish trying to help out and all. So he was. So they're both, even though they were brothers, they're both in whole different time frames now.
Yeah. Well, imagine you see these people walking around out there and talking about ETs and aimlessly not knowing where they are or what's happening, and now some of them are actually sinking into the steel of the ship. And this can really happen, folks, and we're going to get into this in a minute. So what a scary situation, I guess. Evidently, Duncan says, I'm out of here, man.
Yeah, talk about jumping overboard. But it's interesting, did they give any more information about the ETs? Or was that just kind of probably buried in the reports?
I think Al was more concerned about, Al seemed to really be focused on his task at the time to getting this thing shut down.
Yeah.
Excuse me. We'll talk a little bit about the bodies in the deck plates. Now, the first time I heard this, I said, boy, this seems a little outrageous. But there's a fellow who lives in Vancouver, Canada. His name is John Hutchinson. And get this, folks, what he does is he takes different RF, radio frequency energy fields, and focuses them onto different objects. It can be a bar of aluminum, a bar of steel, a bar of brass, and he focuses different RF energy fields on different frequencies, just exactly like what was happening on the Eldridge. But on a smaller scale.
Yeah.
And this is on videotape, folks. You can see it at home. I don't have a copyright for this, but I'll tell you where to get it. And he focuses this energy, and these bars, first they start quivering and vibrating, and all of a sudden they just start falling apart. And I think he dropped either a butter knife or a nickel or something into one of these bars of steel, and it just started sinking right through it.
Wow.
So, does that ring a bell, folks? What was going on the Eldridge with the people, the sailors? And this is really real. In fact, if you want to see this for yourself, folks, didn't have a copyright on it, so I couldn't really show it to you, but this is really real. John Hutchinson and his experiments can be viewed on videotapes from Lightworks Audio and Video. You can go on the web to www.lightworksav, audio video, lightworksav.com, and then click on Free Energy and New Science, and you'll see videotape there by John Hutchinson, or about him and his works. And this is almost exactly like what was going on on the Eldridge.
Right.
And John Hutchinson does other things with these different RF fields at different frequencies. Sometimes he'll focus on a bowling ball, and it'll gravitate. It'll just lift off and smash right up into the ceiling.
Wow.
Or all kinds of objects. The guy, correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but I don't think he's degreed. He can't get any grant money. I don't think. Maybe private industry's financing. I hope somebody's financing it. The guy is brilliant.
Well, you figure that, you know, within the scientific, or let's say the governmental, military, scientific community, what we see in the public venue is probably at least 15 years behind what they really have going. You know, there's all these different layers of reality, and I'm sure if they were doing this back in 1943, can you imagine what they're doing today that we don't know about? I mean,
you know. A lot of people don't realize how advanced Tesla was. Herbert W. Westinghouse actually hired him to solve problems that he couldn't figure out. Thomas Edison hired Nikola Tesla to solve problems, and he did, by the way, that Edison couldn't figure out, and Edison never paid him. Edison owed him 50 grand. And if you don't believe this, there's a video produced by PBS, Public Broadcasting, called Tesla, the Father of Lightning. It's a biography of his life. It's absolutely fascinating.
I'll bet that is a fascinating one.
That's on PBS, so you'd have to go on the web to find that. But the man was way far ahead of his time.
Oh yeah.
You know. But we have so I guess just to sum this up, the outrageous things that seemed outrageous in the beginning, that they were talking about, that were happening on the Eldridge, are really an accepted technology today, folks.
Yes, yeah. Well, you know, it's always interesting because one of the favorite scientific arguments against the UFO phenomena is it's too far for them to get from there to here within, you know, light speed and within the limits of what we know today. And, you know, you think if a race is 100,000, a million years advanced, why would we even think that they haven't figured out other ways and other means to accomplish their task?
Absolutely.
So,
and the talk about wormhole traveling, in the part 2 of this show that we're going to do, Al talks about that. And, you know, Montauk was an underground installation, and it reminds me of a show on the Sci-Fi Channel called Stargate.
Oh, yeah.
And it's an underground installation. They do time travel through wormholes. And gee, I wonder where they got that idea, folks.
I wonder. Yeah.
But anyway, so let's roll our final clip, and you'll hear Al's final words.
There's more to my life than we can put on one film or one interview. And for those of you who see this and watch it, do your own investigations. I invite everyone to do it, no matter whether you believe me or not. I do have a website, if you want to go into that. It's an up and running, www.philadelphia-experiment, and make sure you put the dash in there in the middle, .com. It will tell much more of the history of the Philadelphia experiment and the background And there will be information available there on videotapes that I have, CDs that I have, and all of that. There's one CD I've done that's in-depth analysis of my past. The Philadelphia Experiment of Montauk Project Survivors is the title. It's interviews of 5 people. Yeah, we're getting a little precipitation here. And it's available directly from me, Al Bielek. The best way to get me is through my mailing address, P.O. Box 50045, Fort Myers, Florida 33994. But my story can be proven. It has been by the people in the right places. Thank you, whoever you are, for listening.
Yeah. It is a pretty interesting story, and you know,
Yeah.
it's tough trying to validate something like that that is just so out of the normal way of people of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, many of the aspects to his story now are not so far-fetched anymore.
Yeah.
And I find that very interesting. Anybody wants to get a hold of Al Bielek, feel free to do so at P.O. Box 50045, P.O. Box 50045, Fort Myers, Florida. Fort Myers, Florida 33994. That's 33994. It's got a wonderful website. It's www.philadelphia-experiment.com. And very comprehensive. Many things you can click on that site are a general, in-depth overview of the Philadelphia experiment, Al Bielek's life, a timeline to this story for skeptics. It talks about alien time travel and wormholes. And it gets into the U.S. Navy's official records and the life of Ed Cameron, Nikola Tesla, information about him, information about Dr. John von Neumann, and more specifically things dealing with Montauk and people that were working there. While we've got the #2 camera on us, I want to show the audience here. We have these polo shirts, and as a show promotional idea, they have a cutting-edge logo on them. Camera 2, Peggy.
Camera
Here we
2.
go.
There
There's
we
a
go.
red one and a black one.
I like that.
And one of these shirts can be yours free if, at the beginning of our show, over the next few weeks, during our opening roll, where we have all these different flash images, one of those images is going to be different. The first one to either call or email, and the email and the phone number is on the end of the closing roll of the show right now. The first one to call or email will receive one of these shirts free.
Wow. I'll have to watch.
No,
Oh,
no
no, I guess
mailing
I'm not.
fees or anything, so
No.
we'll just mail it right to you.
That's great.
So
That'll
I
be
thought
fun.
That'd be nice.
That is nice. So you've changed something on the opening roll? Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
it's going to be.
Yeah. We should see how much people pay attention.
You know, I want to say something about John Hutchinson, if we have enough time. He couldn't get, I don't think he could get any grant money or something like that. So he wanted to expand his research, and nobody would help him. The German government said, yeah, we'll give you a whole lab and anything you need, just come to Germany. So he crated up all his equipment from Vancouver, and he decided to go to Germany and do his research over there. And before he could leave the country, they confiscated all of his equipment, and it just never happened. So, but I take my hat off to the guy. He's just amazing, some of the things that he's doing.
It sounds like he must be
Love to
quite
have him
brilliant.
on the show. Anybody knows John Hutchinson, get him down here.
Come on, leave that wintry, Canadian winter, come down to the sunny Southwest.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what he's doing, because it's almost exactly what was happening to the Eldridge, but on a smaller scale, that's
Yeah.
all. And if Al Bielek's watching, and I'm pretty sure he is, I used to work with those 6L6 tubes too. I'm predating post-dating myself, I guess.
I have
Well,
no
thanks.
clue what they are, but
Thanks
that's
for tuning
okay.
in, everybody. Till next time, so long for now, and we certainly appreciate your viewership. Huh? Got a few more seconds.
What are those tubes anyway?
They're amplified.